let me introduce you. I am very happy to be here with Dr. Alan Levinovitz, who is the Associate Professor of Religion at James Madison University in the US. He's the author of a fantastic book called Natural: How Faith in Nature's Goodness Leads to Harmful Fads, Unjust Laws, and Flawed Science, which argues that modern Western culture has divinized nature with all kinds of strange, powerful consequences. He's also the author of The Gluten Lie and Other Myths About What We Eat. He is a scholar of Taoism, and we also share an interest in psychedelics and spiritual experiences. And I feel that psychedelics is weirdly undiscussed in religious studies academia. Is that true or not?
It is true. I couldn't agree more. It's strange to me that it is underdiscussed. When it is discussed, somewhat understandably, it's within the context of traditional religious practices. You'll see it in the throwaway chapter on indigenous religions at the end of a world religions textbook, that kind of thing. You know, in part, it's a fear that drugs are, I think it's a fear that drugs are bad. And if psychedelics are talked about separately from some kind of traditional religious context, it's some sort of tacit endorsement of their use. I mean, that's my guess, but I've tried to start bringing them into my classes a little bit when we just discuss spiritual experiences in general.
Right. Well, I'm fascinated to get onto that. I mean, but like, so really, I really can't think of many books at all. I know, for example, there was a volume of on DMT entity encounters, which David Luke edited, and Jeffrey Kripal had a chapter in that. I haven't got around to reading it yet, but I mean, his work seems so applicable to psychedelics. And then there's kind of books on like anthropological studies of Santo Daime, of Amazon shamanism. So there is that kind of field. But in terms of, you know, trying to, I mean, like, do you know, like, I discovered the other day, Alan, that there are over 200 psychedelic churches in the US, most of which formed in the last few years. There's psilocybin churches, ayahuasca churches, MDMA. There's churches that use ketamine, all of which have different theologies and rituals. And I thought, wow, this is unstudied. It's this growing religious movement that's unstudied.
That's incredible. I didn't know that. I mean, another thing I'm thinking now. So another thing I think might have poisoned the well, so to speak, is, well, there's two things. So one is that when Carlos Castaneda did his stuff, I think there was this reaction against that within academia. This was like, well, we don't want these sort of first person quasi-fictional, but also non-fiction, you know, but it was too much. And so I think that in the same way that, you know, people playing music to their plants kind of put the kibosh on plant communication studies, and then now finally we're getting over the sort of, you know.
Because Carlos Castaneda, just for people who might not know the story or haven't heard that amazing podcast which came out on it, he was a postgrad at Stanford in anthropology.
Was it Stanford? I thought it was Berkeley. I'm not sure. Maybe it was Stanford.
Okay, maybe it was Berkeley. That makes
more
sense.
than I
do. No. And he came back and said, boy, have I got a thesis for you. I've been initiated by a Yaqui shaman and I'm doing battle magic and turning into crows. And everyone was like, that's impressive. And I think there was already consternation about Castaneda. But, you know, his thesis became a massive hit. Huge hit. I mean, a huge hit. Selling out in bookstores. I think it was one of the top 10 books. And then people started, experts on the Yaqui Indians and so forth said this doesn't sound right. And I don't know. Anyway, so it would turn out to be kind of fictional.
That's right. Or quasi, it's like, I mean, yeah, again, I'm not an expert on him, but I think there was something, I think that was that was a bad thing in terms of the academic study of this. And the other thing is that there's this, in religious studies, at least, and I can speak to that, from personal experience, even when I was in graduate school, there was this sort of personal professional division that people tried to at least, no one ever talked about their own religious beliefs. I always found it very strange. Here I am at the divinity school getting my PhD in religion, we're talking theology, and everyone's going through it. No, I'm like, so do you believe in God? Like, what do you believe in? Some kind of, I'd just be curious what people's personal experiences were. And that was kind of off the table. And I think there was a sense that, I don't know, that psychedelics somehow blurred the personal and the professional in ways that were unacceptable in academia. And of course, there's some back and forth on this. Actually a really interesting guy at Brown, Harold Roth, who is pioneering something he calls a first-person critical perspective on religion. Right. And so he brings his students into labs, which is what he calls them, like the lab for his class on Taoism. You actually practice the religious techniques. And that's, I think it's, but that's new, right? Academians are very wary of that sort of thing.
Yes. Okay. So there's, I mean, and I'm just kind of thinking about the history of psychedelics in academia and religious studies. I mean, there was Houston Smith, and there was people like, well, Walter Pankey. He was in Harvard Seminary School, wasn't he? So, and Houston Smith, is he influential in religious studies?
Again, so, and this would be great for our conversation in general, bringing together the sort of the history of academia. So Houston Smith, again, was one of these guys, and you've written about this as well, who was very much of the different paths of the same mountain sort of approach to religion. That's right. Yeah. So for him, there were these underlying truths. They get lacquered with cultural frameworks, but ultimately they are all the same, and they were not all the same, but in essence the same, and whatever differences there are tangential. Right? This is Jefferson. This goes all the way back to Jefferson. This idea that we want to cut out all the lousy miracle stuff and get down to the essence that every religion shares, which is something kindness, love, etc. Which is, again, I have my own opinion on that, but there was a big academic backlash to this. So you have Stephen Prothero writing a big, very popular religion sort of textbook called God Is Not One, in which he's saying, no, this is wrong. It flattens all the religious traditions. They are not all paths up the same mountain. And so I think that also psychedelics were tied to, as you've observed in your writing, this sense that there's an underlying spiritual reality that all ecstatic experiences tap into, and academics are like,
Nicholas Langlitz, I don't know if you've read his work. He's a great, I don't know if it's sociology or anthropology, because I'm not in these disciplines, but it's something like that. He did a great book called Neuropsychedelia, looking at the cultural frames for psychedelics, particularly in different labs. So he looked at like psychedelic labs in the US, psychedelic labs in Switzerland. Anyway, and he coined this term acid perennialism and it really helped me to think about the cultural frames that shape psychedelics, which has been really interesting to me. And I'm still, working on that and writing about it, articulating the cultural scaffolding which informs our trips.
It's super important, very, very important. And I mean, there's a similar kind of thing in religious studies in general. So I mean, it'd be interesting for you, maybe as you research this, the same kind of thing happens with miracles. So the types of healings that occur, or the ways in which miracles manifest, of course, also culturally conditioned. And this is something I say to my students when I'm trying to encourage them to be more skeptical. Is I say, well, how often has Mother Teresa appeared in the clouds to people who've never heard of her? And the answer, of course, is very rarely do you get Christian miracle appearances or experiences in cultures that are conditioned to see Christian images. So I think there's something like that operative in psychedelic experiences as well.
So people in academia looking to do that kind of balance of, for example, incorporating the first, their experiences, but not just being a prophet or preacher. So trying to do that balancing act. It was one of the anyway, I could bring in Max Weber here, and him warning about academic prophets who preach their own values. So you're not just indoctrinating your students, you're saying, or your readers, you're saying, this is my experience, but one could interpret it these ways. And that's the difference between an academic and a preacher, I guess. And like Timothy Leary, for example,
became a preacher, essentially. Yeah.
He stepped off that tightrope and became a preacher and said, right, I'm going to start a religion. So there are people doing that. There's Jeffrey Kripal has talked about the mystical humanities. He's talked about, his own spiritual experiences, like he had an erotic encounter with Kali. when he was a postgrad. And also I'd say, connected to this, in the kind of medical humanities and in the history of the emotions, which was a field I was, connected with in when I was in London, you do also have people talking about, their own experiences of mental health and mental illness. Like Barbara Walters, who wrote about, her experiences of being sectioned. I got another former colleague called, who talks about her own sex life, but then also from a kind of critical historical perspective.
So someone who crossed this boundary successfully as an academic is Tanya Luhrmann. I don't know if you're familiar with her, but she wrote
Yes,
this.
I've interviewed her. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So she crossed it successfully. I mean,
but I mean, she really didn't bring in much of her personal. A bit. She said,
bit.
when I did all these meditation practices, right. Unusual things happened. But yeah, but her work is fantastic.
So I have a question for you, which is related to my own spiritual experiences, but also, which I'd be interested in talking about as well, but also to something that I'm sort of fascinated by, which is that a lot of people who have had spiritual experiences, whether on psychedelics or whether traditional religious experiences, whatever, and we can talk about what distinguishes these experiences, they like to talk about what the experiences showed them. So there's some kind of undifferentiated love, or I saw Christ, or whatever. So these experiences are seen as disclosures. And my own personal interest in this intersects with my professional interests with sort of proto-Taoist classics, which is that I don't understand why there aren't more people who feel the way I do, which is, well, I guess there's a sort of, this question answers itself, but why aren't there more people that are like, well, I'm not allowed to talk about what it showed me? Or there is no, I mean, there is a little bit of, there is no way to talk about this. This is called, so for the listeners, this is called apophatic theology. And there's a tradition of this in various mystical traditions where you can't speak about things. You can't predicate the divine but when you do it, you sort of insult the divine. I wouldn't want to say that, because if you say that, then you're violating the rules. But it is strange to me that there aren't more people having these experiences and then kind of being like, I don't know, man, I'm not really allowed to talk about what it disclosed.
Well, I mean,
I don't know.
Yes, but I guess the point is, Alan, that we wouldn't know.
That's right. I know. That's why I said the question answers itself.
I mean, you could do a survey of ecstatic experiences and say, I know that I did because I wrote this, The Art of Losing Control, and I researched ecstatic experiences and tried to make sense of them analytically for 5 years, which is also a head fuck. Yeah. And like that's like a dog chasing its own tail. But I did all these kind of surveys. I did surveys of people's dream lives. I did, like I'm talking about through my newsletter. And I asked people, have you ever had a mystical or ecstatic experience? And 84% of my readers had, which says something about my readers. But 3/4 felt there was a taboo about it. So I don't know. I think probably there are lots of people who feel like they don't want to talk about it, partly because maybe it feels too precious to them, too sensitive, but also because they don't want to be, the thought of someone mocking them for an experience that means so much to them.
This is interesting. That is actually not what I mean. What I mean is that you're not allowed to buy the thing. So like when my students, for example, when I started talking about my spiritual experiences, my students would ask me questions like, well, so what did you, what was it? I'm answering honestly, that I'd have to say to many of their questions, I was not allowed to answer that. And that doesn't mean it's a taboo or I'm embarrassed. It means literally the rules of the game are, it sounds like a paradox, but one way what was disclosed to me, I guess, if you want to call it that, is that I'm not allowed. I wouldn't want to speak for anyone else. I'm not allowed to say the answer to those questions.
I think
it's not about a taboo or embarrassment. It's simply, I'm not allowed to. I can't.
Well, this is like, the Holy of Holies, and that there are these guardrails around the sacred. And if you take away those guardrails, you lose the sacred. But I think it depends. Like, in certain forms of Christianity, you you have one, if you have an ecstatic experience, a Holy Spirit encounter, probably the next week, you're put on the stage at church and said, tell us about your Holy Spirit encounter, preach. And it's seen that, so the kind of experience to talking about it pipeline is very short.
Yes.
In certain forms of evangelical or ecstatic Christianity, like
Yeah.
the
So I
Quakers, constantly writing
absolutely.
about it, constantly talking about it.
So this is, I would never in a million years, because I'm not allowed to say anything like those are bad or don't count or that's not how
Yeah,
it should be. All I can say is that for me, very important repeated spiritual experiences came with a kind of personal guardrails around them or rules or something. I don't know what I would want to call it, because I get very wary talking about it, because one of the things that was impressed upon me by these experiences was just how wary I should be when I'm yakking about them. And you know, so to take an example from something you wrote, I thought was really interesting. You were, so what was it you were writing? Maybe it was your Huxley piece where they're talking about the Buddha, and he's saying, well, the Buddha doesn't believe there's an ego, but does believe there's an undifferentiated self or something like that. Okay. To me, when I read many Buddhist texts, one of the things that strikes me is that they are not straightforward cataphatic statements. So if you get, it's like the parable of the burning house, for example. I don't know how many people are familiar with this, but if, you know, there's this whole story about this rich guy who's got to get his sons out of this burning house. And so he lies to them and tells them there's a bunch of cool toys outside. I'm paraphrasing here. Lies to them, tells them a bunch of cool toys outside, because he knows that if he tells them the truth, they won't get out of the house. Once he's got them out of the house, there's all these chariots that are way beyond anything they could have imagined. And then the Buddha says to his disciples, so did this guy deceive them? And to me, it's manifestly true that he did, right? I mean, it's just, he lied to them, but it's okay. And if this is a parable about what Buddha's teaching is, it seems to me that we should at least be thinking to ourselves, well, anytime the Buddha opens his mouth, he might be winking, or it might be provisional truth that leads to something else. And it's that kind of, I don't see, for me at least, going ahead and translating that into kind of straightforward analytic statements is almost like a betrayal of the genre. It's like taking a riddle and telling someone the answer first, or taking a joke and explaining it. Like you just transform the thing. And
well,
that's something, yeah, I don't know.
this is true, and this is a big problem with the whole project of rational spirituality from William James onwards, which is the attempt to create a kind of rational empirical spirituality. And I love that tradition, and I suppose I see myself as a part of it. But there's all kinds of paradoxes and maybe built-in flaws. I feel this about the book The Art of Losing Control, that it was an attempt to turn poetry into prose. And mysticism does not make for kind of non-fiction quasi-academic
No,
text.
no,
And
no, no.
and it's almost like you're kind of trying to, because what you're trying to do is, you think you're doing good work because you're trying to expand the kind of non-fiction academic quasi-academic discourse to include these experiences, because otherwise they're left out. And yet in that attempt, you may be doing grievous harm to these experiences.
So again, I would never want to say that someone's doing grievous harm to them. I love academia. I mean, so a really good example of this from my own sort of professional and personal interest, the Zhuangzi, which is this proto-Taoist classic book. That's just a terrific book. One of the three Taoist classics, the Tao Te Ching, the Zhuangzi, and the Liezi. No one reads the Liezi. So the Zhuangzi, at one point, this
And this
translator,
is
Burton
spelled
Watson, it's spelled,
Z-H-U-A,
yeah,
Zhuangzi. That's how it is.
Zhuang, and then Zi, which just means master. It's an honorific. That's right. So in this book, it's very funny because at one point, okay, paraphrase. Sorry, an aside. Burton Watson, a translator of the Zhuangzi and a translator of many Chinese classics and Japanese classics, said at one point that when he was asked to write about the Zhuangzi, he felt like he could hear, write an introduction, something. He felt like he could hear the author of the Zhuangzi cackling away at, I think he says, the futility of such an endeavor, which is very funny. But to illustrate something about how the problem with taking mystic or paradoxical spirituality and sort of spreading it is in the Zhuangzi, there's a passage where he talks about longevity practices, which were common at the time. And he says, basically, longevity practices, look at all these people imitating Pengzi, the oldest man in the world. That's so ridiculous. If they wanted to live a long time, they should imitate this tree, Ningling, that's lived for thousands of years, which is, it's sort of a joke, right? It's like, what are you doing?
Imitate this stream.
Tree,
got you.
Tree that has lived for thousands of years.
Right.
So what's funny is a couple generations later, the Zhuangzi is a part of Taoist religious traditions. People recite it, they recite the Tao Te Ching, and they do it as a part of longevity practices. So here is this sort of mystical, paradoxical book that got transformed not many, hundreds of years later into very straightforward, practical teachings with rules about how you live forever and how you avoid disease and all this stuff. So I think there is something to, mysticism and paradox is inherently resistant to being turned into evangelism for obvious reasons. And so what happens is these whenever there is a kind of powerful mystic experience, it gets transformed from apophatic or mysterious into cataphatic. And this is what you should learn from it, right? Here are the rules that we got from this. Right. I don't know. I don't think rules are bad, but it's just hard to avoid that sort of dynamic.
Yes. And it's also mystical experiences are both, can be like both and paradoxical. And the paradox gets collapsed into one or the other. So like mystical experiences can be euphoric and joyful and meaningful, but they can also be bewildering, terrifying. But in the evangelism, in the hype, the darker side tends to get left out. And we're seeing this happen in the kind of neo-therapeutic psychedelic religion, broadly described, because it is, whether it's medical or spiritual or life coaching, it's kind of an amorphous religion. And the kind of, really bad experiences, which just leave people in a worse state, is kind of like the satanic verses of this new religion. It's like, it doesn't fit with the narrative. But I also think, even more when we try to quantify mystical experiences, which again is something that's been happening, part of this William James Science of Religions, Rational Spirituality project, and then using brief questionnaires to try and capture it. And again, it's like, well, if we don't do that, we're not measuring this and it just gets left out. So this is what all these psychedelic scientists say. And the people right at the top, of course, see the limits of their models and of course see the problems, and they have a more nuanced view, but they see these models and surveys as a kind of necessary evil. But they get rolled out, they get passed out, and all the nuance and the qualifications get lost. And you just, it's very blunt, oh, this leads to this experience. You're definitely going to have a non-dual, unitive, blissful experience, which is going to wonderfully transform your life for the better.
Yes. And these things, like you said, right, I don't, it's almost certainly the case that most people who are working on this are, understand all this stuff. The problem is that it's almost built into genres, right? Which is that if you want to publish an academic article, or if you even want to publish a book, right? I mean, best of luck writing up a book proposal that's just riddled with paradoxes and admissions of uncertainty. No one wants it. No publishing house is going to buy that. And unless you're some kind of master of mystical literature, in which case you'll be, posthumously famous, but then everyone will take your book and transform it into a straightforward self-help book anyway. There's a question of how you could even express these things in any kind of context other than perhaps your own inner monologue or a conversation with people in a room that never gets out of that room or something,
Or you hold up a flower,
right.
or you write or you write a novel, or yeah. But I mean, nonetheless, you have with you have started to talk about some of your own experiences too. So tell me, like, when did you do that, and how, and what did you share? And tell me a bit about what you do feel kind of comfortable talking about.
So there's some things I'm very comfortable talking about because they don't touch on the things that I'm not allowed to talk about. So for example, I can talk about how long it lasted. So these experiences, I had the first one when I was in college. I started talking about this about First, I started talking with my wife about it, and then I started talking with more people about it. But these experiences started when I was in college, was the first one. And it lasted for weeks. So that's something I'm very
Mm,
comfortable talking about. I slept for about an hour a night, and
mm,
everything looked beautiful. Everyone looked like a sage. The first time it happened, I remember I was in the hallway of my dorm, and I was maybe a week in or something. And I looked at the palm of my hand, and I just felt this incredible sort of tapping into this power around me. And I was like, I could make fire come out of the palm of my hand. I'm going to do it here. And I tried, and of course, it didn't work because that's not how it
mm.
works. And that's actually something I am comfortable saying is that that's not how these things work. So there are certain kinds of truths that I feel very comfortable saying. You are not. This does not give you the power to levitate. It does not give you the power to heal people. It does not give you the power to make fire come out of your hand. That's bullshit. And it was funny because I remember laughing and sitting there and realizing that this incredible thing was happening. Like I'd been confused that I thought one kind of power was actually another kind of power. At any rate,
Oh, so you clocked that in this in that state, in
yeah,
this kind
in
of
that state.
exalted state,
That's right.
your capacity for kind of probability reasoning was online at the same time.
Yeah. And so this went on for many weeks, and it was just incredible. And then it went away, and I was a little bit distressed because I wanted it back. And I was
Were
like, I
you
was just in
studying
heaven.
religious studies at the time?
I was, although I'm not a religious person. I've done lots of psychedelics. So I had sort of comparative things. I mean, it was a little bit like ecstasy, it was a little bit like acid, it was a little bit like mushrooms, but also fundamentally different in that it went on for weeks, and I felt very clear-headed, and I could talk with other people and live my life. At night I would just lie in bed, awake, thinking of wonderful things. And when it
Wow.
ended, I was really distressed, and I wanted it back. I remember reading something in Thomas Merton, who's Catholic monk in Seeds of Contemplation, where he says something like the worst way to understand God is to experience God when you're young, because then you think that that's what religion is about, is trying to have this experience again. And I was like, okay, all right. Merton knows something. I'm not a Catholic, but Merton seems to know about this. So I just kind of let it go. But I didn't talk about it with anyone. And I tried to do research on it. I was like, has anyone else had this kind of experience? And one of the things I encountered was I had a lot of difficulty labeling it. So manic, it sounded a lot like manic experiences. I read about manic experiences, and I was like, okay, this sort of sounds like what I had, but I don't have depression. I didn't blow all my money on anything. You know what I mean? It was like sort of related, but sort of not. Then I looked at, it wasn't like the psychedelic experience I had, it was like the religious experience I had. Long story short, it happened again to me. Maybe 4 years later, I was walking down the street spontaneously. So there's not only one time was it catalyzed. I was like, oh my God, it's happening again. I remember this. It's incredible. It lasted many weeks, went away, but this time when it went away, it didn't hurt quite as much. It's sort of like, all right,
Uh-huh.
well, I guess these things come and go. And those experiences have come and gone throughout my life. They've happened, maybe 9, 10 times. And they're a little bit different each time, in part just because I've had them before, so I sort of understand what they are. And that's a lot of what so I'm comfortable talking about all of that, in part because it doesn't involve pronouncing on any of the things that I'm not allowed to pronounce on.
And how did you know you're not allowed to pronounce on them? How did that? I mean, this was just okay. I don't want to. I don't want to. I suppose you felt a strong intuition or message that there were some things that what you shouldn't talk about, some aspects of
No,
that experience.
no, it was like, so not like a no. So it's more like I came to understand something, and I realized and I realize even now, outside of the experience, that if I talk about it, it will no longer be that thing. So it's more like someone's like, I'm going to tell you a secret. And it's like, okay.
Hmm.
And then you're told the secret. And they're like, you gotta keep it secret, you know? But like, it's not a secret anymore if you disclose it. That's sort of one of the things about secrets. So as soon as you tell, it's not a secret anymore. So it's just, I know, sort of built into the rules of reality, I guess I would say, that there's certain things that I just can't say.
Mm. I
If that
mean,
makes sense. I don't mean to
it
sound
does. It does.
I
It
don't
does.
mean
No,
to
it
sound
does
like
makes total
playful or
sense.
annoying, you know. I know it sounds
No.
like controlling and scary, but like I
Well, it's
really
so
wish I
different.
could.
I literally think you're the first person I've met who's like, you know, you're like a kind of a vegan who doesn't want to talk about the fact that they're a vegan. It's a rare thing. You know
Yeah,
what I
well,
mean?
that's
Like
what
people
I wanted to ask you. Like, are there other
in
people?
new age culture, like, oh my gosh, you know, it's like, yeah, but let me tell you about my experience. And certainly, I mean, look, I have written about, I mean, I wrote at the end of my first book about ancient Greek philosophy. I said, all of that I've described in this book, Stoicism and so on, is about rational, self-controlled approaches to healing and flourishing. But there is another way to healing and flourishing. And I only wrote this appendix because my publisher said it's not long enough. You need another 10 pages. So I was like, oh, I've got something I could put in there. So I talked about this near-death experience I had when I was 24, 25. And that experience, you know, helped me to recover from 5, 6 years of mental illness. And it was, you know, it was a bad accident where I fell off a mountain and I had a white light type encounter. It was wonderful. And I have, you know, and I've talked about it a bit since, and I've written about it a bit since. It feels like, in a way, a bit pointless to write about and talk about, but partly because I got very useful wisdom from that experience about you are enough, don't reach after externals, you know, basic stuff. But it was very felt wisdom. But you say that, it doesn't help people. You know what I mean? Like it may have convinced me, but me saying it will not convince anyone else. But yeah, so I guess the reason I do write about it and talk about it is partly to just note that those kinds of things happen and that they're part of human experience.
I really don't want to. I emphatically don't want to make it seem like I think people shouldn't talk about their experiences
No, no, no,
or
no, no.
study them or anything like that. I think it's great. In fact, I'm like, part of me is just like, I've looked online. I'm like, are there any other people that have these, like, that go on for weeks and they're uncatalyzed and then they stop or something? Like, is that something that people experience? Or is it, most of the ones I've seen are like, usually it's like, you know, 5 hours to a couple of days or something. Whereas for me, there really were like much, it was like 6 weeks of sleeping
Well,
an hour a night
have
or
you
something.
looked at, I mean, like, have you looked into the literature on this?
A little bit, but I'm not
A little bit.
this is why I'm so excited to talk
Yeah.
to you. I
I
don't know.
mean,
Mania is the
so
closest thing I've seen
yes,
to something like it.
I am particularly, what I've researched is particularly kind of um spiritual. I mean, I've researched ecstatic experiences, and often they are, yes, they're more like for a few hours
Yeah.
or a few days, but they're still like life changing. So, you know, and
Right.
people like, you know, Yeats writes poems about it, and, you know, Philip Pullman, I interviewed him, the Dark Materials author, about, you know, he's walking down Charing Cross Road and then he suddenly
Yeah.
goes
Yeah.
into
Yeah.
this other
Yeah.
state of consciousness. But and it really, you know, he says it altered his life. But but yes, I've come across people who've had him for, you know, it's lasted weeks.
Yeah. Have.
In Yes, yeah, I'm just transcribing another interview of someone who had what he describes as a sartorial awakening that lasted for weeks. The field I've started researching and
Wow.
writing about
That's really interesting.
has been, well, and he'll be fascinated to hear your story too, has been spiritual emergencies. So I am where for one reason or other, that beautiful awakening experience has been quite challenging as well. So, for example, the person I just interviewed yesterday, who I'm transcribing the interview of, he was working on Wall Street, and he started to feel more energy and kind of clarity, and then he had this awakening experience where he felt in touch with the Tao, as he put it, and bathed with joy. I'm literally kind of quoting from memory because I was transcribing it just before talking to you. And his senses were wide open. Now, but with him, it was challenging as well. And the challenges were it led quite quickly, he says, to spiritual narcissism, to a kind of bit of a messiah complex. It led to him kind of going, right, I'm going to completely reject my life. He was married. His wife was like, what's happened to my husband? He quit his job and then kind of struggled to know what to do. Tried training to be a Jungian analyst, a life coach.
Is this after the Satori ended? He had done all of these things,
well,
and now he was
no,
sort of picking up the pieces,
it was ongoing, but it became more and more like, what should I do? And it turned, in his case, into like serious depression, lasting for about 3 years, which he came out of through ketamine therapy. And now he's kind of trying to balance these different aspects of himself, the highly intellectual aspect of himself and the more ecstatic, altered state side of himself. And he's managed to do that. In my book, the book that I co-edited with Tim Reed, called Breaking Open, Finding a Way Through Spiritual Emergency, one of the chapters in there is about a guy at university, and he has an awakening experience where all the normal noise in his head goes away, and he feels deeply calm and illuminated. And what happened to him was he started talking and teaching. He stopped wearing shoes, and he became like the barefoot guru. And he started to get, people noticed he was illuminated. So he started to get, people come to hear his talks, his professors and his students as well. And then it passed after a few weeks. And he was like, I have a choice here. I'm at a crossroads. I can keep on playing that role, or I can admit that I'm not enlightened as I thought I was. And thankfully, he chose the second path. But it was very hard. It was bewildering because he thought he was enlightened.
Yeah. This is so fascinating. So, I mean, these are similar. I had similar, not like those. I had enough experiences the first time it happened, like the fire in my hand. I mean, there was another similar thing that happened the first time, because I'd never had this happen before. And I became extremely, I mean, I'm a guy who likes to talk with people. I was extremely charismatic during these experiences.
Yeah.
And there was, and I couldn't hold it in. There's this line in Mengzi, like regulating your flood like chi. And like the first time I just could not regulate this kind of charisma that came with it. And I remember there was one time where I saw these, I don't know if these looked like people looking for like manual labor, which is in California, right? People waiting for manual labor early in the morning. So I was wandering around all the time, at all times, because I didn't sleep. And I was like, these guys, they're looking for manual labor. Like, I'm going to go over there. I'm going to help them. I speak Spanish. I'm going to be able to tell them how to not just have to look for manual labor, they can put a company together. And I walked over and I realized, as soon as I greeted them, it just hit me how ludicrous what it was I was doing. It's like, what the hell are you doing? It's like the fire thing, Alan. What are you doing? And so again, it was very funny, and I withdrew from it. And there was one other experience of potential narcissism during that, which is that I had gone into this cafe, and I was able to charm anyone I wanted during this experience. And there was this one woman working at the cafe behind the counter, and I just couldn't charm her. And she looked to me. She started to look like a demon. For lack of a better word. And so I got very scared. I was like, it's a demon. Okay, I got to get out of here. And later, I was just like, what the hell, Alan? She just didn't want to talk with you. It's not a demon. It's fine. It's fine. That's narcissism, thinking that someone who can't be charmed. And so I had these sort of, in the experience, I had these kind of hilarious moments.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, yeah, it does make total sense. And you dealt with them really well, particularly considering you were 19, 20 or something.
Yeah.
But I think in that, from what I can see, in those very altered, expanded states, which last for a long time. It's like being, it's comparable to being on psychedelics for
Absolutely.
days and days.
In many ways, it is exactly
In many
like that.
ways.
Yeah.
And you know, so in that very raw state and sensitive state, little things can put people into different states. So, for example, if you get into a thought process of like, well, maybe I'm in some kind of unique state, like maybe I'm in a uniquely special state, that leads to spiritual inflation, but it also leads to paranoia. Like, well, if I'm uniquely special, are people out to get me? Like, you know, do
Wow.
I need to do some kind of cosmic sacrifice for the universe? This kind of thing, because I'm uniquely special. So
That's
that's
scary.
one thing.
That's
And
so
then
that causes
also
spiritual emergencies, you're saying. That's one kind of spiritual emergency, is
that's
that
one of the
flip.
ways that
That's
people can
terrifying.
go wrong. There's also like what am I? Oh yeah. So you're in this high state. This is there was a little bit of this in the waitress as demon thing. You're on this high state, but if someone then doesn't kind of somehow obstructs your high state or doesn't join in it, or you know, then they're the kind of the enemy of
Yeah,
the age
yeah,
of
yeah,
love.
yeah, yeah.
There's the age of
That's right.
love, and they're the enemy of it. So they are the forces of darkness, and that
Yeah.
happens in spiritual communities over and over.
Yes, yeah. So it's fun. The thing about that was in the first experience, actually, but in also the subsequent ones, it was a very overall humbling
Mm,
experience. So I had the experience of everyone else being a sage, and
right.
so it was. I know. I mean, there was a sense of like uniqueness, sort of. No, not exactly. It wasn't a sense of uniqueness. Actually, it was a sense that in my other state, somehow I had not, it's sort of like the idea, the sort of anti-Buddhist, everyone is already a Buddha kind of thing. It's like, how did I not see that everyone is a Buddha? Shut up and listen to these people. I remember there's this one time, there was this guy, Krishna, which at the time was like super significant because you know how these experiences are, right? Every
Yeah.
synchronicity, everything is bristling with meaning. It's all got a purpose. So I'm going through the cafeteria line and they employed people with learning disabilities often to work in the cafeteria line. There's this one guy who wear a helmet, I guess because he seizes sometimes. And I'd always sort of uncomfortably looked away from him. And in this experience, I was like, I can't believe it. Why was I uncomfortable? Like his name's Krishna, for God's sake, And I go up and he's highlight. Noticed for the first time he was highlighting the newspaper. And I was like, oh my gosh, like he must be highlighting, And then it was the same sort of humorous thing. I was like, he must be highlighting like the truths of the universe. And I was like, Krishna, what are you doing? He's like, I'm highlighting the newspaper. And I look at it. It was just, just random. And I was like, you idiot. Like he's just highlighting random stuff. Like he's not reading it. He's just highlighting random things, So again, there was this like that dynamic happened safely and humorously. Although outside of those experiences, I have noticed that sometimes I do things that hurt people without realizing it, thinking that like it's going to be okay or it's fine. You don't need to obey courtesy norms. I mean, nothing terrible, right? Like I know people have done really horrible things, but that is like a sort of problem within those that got better as they went on because I was more able to recognize them and control them.
You mean like not obeying social norms?
Yeah, and like even so, like if you're charming someone, which is
That's
fine,
power. That's using power. That's
dominating
kind of
even
that's magic. When you
that's
use charisma for power, that's magic.
is magic. It's magic, and if you're not very conscious of when you're dominating people, like if you're just having a good time, they may even have a good time too, or they just might submit or something, but it's not necessarily
But it's
fun
going to
for
lead to some
them.
kind of
And
hangover.
afterwards, it might, yeah, but yeah, it's gonna have a
Yeah,
hangover or something. And so that was something I was unaware of, or very only dimly aware of the first time it happened. But yeah, so I don't know.
that's
So
really
this
interesting.
and
That's really
comparing it with
interesting.
drugs too, I'd had the experience of having taken ecstasy. And so I was like, okay, well, this love of everything. It was really funny. The first time I was like, I got to talk with someone about it because I love to talk with people. I got to talk with someone. Who do I talk to? Everyone's going to think I'm nuts. And I was like, my friend, Mark James, he's an evangelical Christian. He'll understand. So I sat Mark down. I was like, Mark, you're not going to believe what's going on with me. the whole world is like transformed and everything's beautiful. And he's like, that's the Holy Spirit, man. Like, congratulations. I was like, this is amazing, you know. And I even had this sense, I was like, wait a second, do I believe in Christianity? Like, I almost had this like, I was like, wait, do we believe in the same thing? And I was like, no, I don't think we do. But like, at least he gets where I'm coming from. I don't know. It was very funny.
Yeah, I mean, while researching the art of losing control, which is partly trying to make sense of this near-death experience, this ecstatic white light experience, I was like, maybe that's like the Holy Spirit encounter. And these Christians seem to be accessing that regularly. So maybe they've developed a cultural container, and maybe, you know, it's not the only, I was still a perennialist, so and I probably still am, but like, okay, this isn't you know, I'm not really on board with their whole Jesus is the only path to God, but maybe this is a useful, you know, and I'm British, so I can go to an Anglican ecstatic church. And I became a Christian for like, you know, 2 years during that book, because, you know, because that's how it was presented to me. Like, oh, you're having an ecstatic experience, therefore you're, you know, be a Christian, and, you know, that kind of thing. And then I kind of followed the ecstasy, as it were, but my mind was like, no, you don't actually accept most of this. So I don't, you know, like you keep, you know, this, you know, it would involve yogic contortions for you to be able to stay in this church. But I mean, you're familiar with Buddhism by the sounds of it. Um, did you think about talking about theological explanations for this kind of experience? Did you think about the Buddhist idea of the jhanas?
I don't know about the Buddhist idea of the jhanas. What are they?
Well, I don't know much about it, though. There are people now who study them, and you know, there's a whole online hardcore meditator thing, and they're all about, so okay, in Buddhist teachings, as far as I understand, there are what known as the 4 jhanas, and these are um, uh, consecutively deeper bliss states
Oh
that
yeah,
you
these are
go
like the
through.
levels of awareness, and then like within
Yeah,
them, there's like
that you go through on
subcategories of them.
a
Yeah.
meditation. And the first jhana spontaneously arose for the Buddha, supposedly, when he was a young man or when he was a boy, and he was sitting watching someone plow a field and in the grass, and he was so relaxed that this blissful state arose. And he thought, and then later on, when he was looking for enlightenment, he thought, well, maybe it's partly about returning to the natural blissfulness of the mind, that first jhana, and observing it, and then you go deeper. Because initially, there's all kinds of things about how you relate to the jhanas. There's a temptation to get attached to it because it's so blissful. So you have to constantly like just observe the arising and passing. And so there's people like, I mean, I work with this thing called the Emergent Phenomena Research Consortium, Alan, which you'd actually love.
What's this job? Your job. What a great job. I mean, I know this. It always looks better from the outside. It's like ice cream taster. But yeah, go on.
Well, you would love this. So this is a group of researchers who study unusual mystical type experiences, including spiritual emergencies and mystical psychosis. But I mean, it was founded by someone, a doctor called Daniel Ingram. He's got an interesting story, and but he says he kind of goes through the jhanas quite regularly, the first, second, third, fourth, and it's like this quite regular cycling through them. And there are others in the States. There's lots of people who talk about the jhanas. So that's one way one could think about
I
it.
have heard of these. I'm
Yeah.
very scared personally of hierarchies of any kind.
Yeah.
And even words like higher and lower, or deeper or less deep, really freak me out personally.
Yeah.
Other people
Yeah.
can do whatever they want with them. I
Yeah.
have no problem. Who am I to say what people should talk about? But for me, I get really wary of, I mean, in Tibetan Buddhism, right, there's all these different ways you can ascend or descend. The idea that you
Yeah.
pass a test or something shifts into something else.
Yeah.
I am personally really wary of those. And I think I think that it's funny because I'm trying to figure out how I want to say this in a way that's allowed.
Yeah,
I'll tell you, here's what I'll say. In the
yeah.
Zhuangzi, Zhuangzi has a best friend named Huizi. And Huizi is a logician. And he's sort of Zhuangzi's foil. So like Huizi will be like, I had this gourd and I couldn't figure out what to do with it. So I got mad and smashed it. And Zhuangzi was like, why didn't you like float around in the rivers on it, you idiot? You know? And so when people have read this, classical Chinese commentators and contemporary scholars, it's always like Huizi is the stick in the mud. Zhuangzi is the free and easy wandering guy. Zhuangzi is the guy that's in touch with the Tao. Huizi is the guy that doesn't get it. And I've always been very wary of that. Like, that's not, they're friends. When Huizi dies, Zhuangzi is like, my friend is gone. I cannot do what I used to do, which was talk with my friend about stuff anymore now that he's gone. And he mourns him, which is really weird because Zhuangzi is always like, death, what the hell's death? You know, but he's really sad about his friend leaving. And like, I don't know. There was something about making Huizi the sort of the heel or the foil that struck me as really sad and mean. And that's, I guess, what I have to say about higher and lower than hierarchies.
Yeah, I am also, one of the things that happens with people thinking about ecstatic experiences is people create maps for them, but the maps can become overly prescriptive. So people love, for example, Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey, and the person I just interviewed found that very helpful in their life. But then what happens is often you go to like psychedelic retreats or spiritual retreats, and they say you're on the hero's journey. You must be on stage 3, and maybe on so you're just coming through. And it's the same, of course. You know, Buddhism is so systematic, and so it does create these maps of the mind. And some people swear by these maps and say, "Oh, you must be at the stage of passing and arising. Oh, you're at jhana 3 now." But you know, and then there's also the kind of followers of Ken Wilber, who, I don't know if you've come across that.
I don't know him, no.
Transpersonal psychology. And he's the ultimate systematizer. And he's all about the maps and the quadrants. And you're in quadrant 4, therefore you're,
That's so amazing. Just a book of spiritual maps would be, I have a similar book that's like, how have people visualized time, like timelines and time maps throughout the ages. And I feel like spiritual maps would be amazing. I would love to see this.
Would be
amazing. Here are the quadrants, or here's the ladder, or here's the temporal journey, or whatever. It's really interesting that you say that, but it makes a lot of sense. I never thought about that.
Oh yeah, there are people who love the maps, and there are people who love particular maps, and then there's people who try to make maps of maps, like meta maps, which is kind of what Ken Wilber tried to do. I mean, he tried to make different developmental models, and there are people in something called metamodernism who try to combine different developmental pathways and models. So that can become overly rigid. How did you make sense of these experiences, and how did you integrate them in your life? And like, give me a bit of the kind of cultural context of your life.
Yeah, so cultural context, I was, like where I was, like what I was doing.
Well, so over the last how many years, if this is the kind of an ongoing thing.
Yeah, it's an ongoing thing. This happened when I was an undergrad. Then I went to China with my then girlfriend, now wife, who was neither of us spoke much Chinese, but we wanted to go on so we went to China, came back, I went to grad school in Chicago, studied the Zhuangzi there, and then came to Virginia and became a professor. So that's the arc of my life. In that sense. There's a lot of things missing, like all the important stuff. But the making sense of them, it's really interesting that you say that. One thing that I kept trying to do, and even now, now I'm not trying to do it anymore quite as much, but I just wanted to know what it was. So I was like, is it mania? I found something called hypomania, which was people who are just generally happy all the time and can't experience sadness. So these were really interesting people to me. I was like, this sounds sort of like how I was, because there were some things about the experiences that really distressed me. And that didn't distress me, but were puzzling. It's the first time it happened. And actually, in every experience, this has been a constant, is that pain is very hard for me to understand. So I just don't understand pain. And I'm just like, well, why would you ever be in pain? It's just like bewildering to me, right? I was like, why would you ever be in pain? So when I'm out of the experience, I'm like, well, God, of course you'd be in pain for all kinds of reasons, like you idiot, you know? And so I'm like, well, what kind of experience is like this? So I was like, well, is it? So I tried to use vocabulary from psychology, and that just didn't descriptively match. I'm not manic depressive. I don't, I mean, I just like none of these things. So I was like, all right, well, so is it a religious experience? And I was like, well, a lot of these religious, the William James. I mean, I went down sort of like it, not in any kind of like a deep way that you have, but sort of like trying to figure, like poking around, or is this like the drug experiences I've had? So that was how I made fun, or not make, I tried to make sense of it, was by parallels to other experiences. And I couldn't, and I've sort of, and that's fine. What I did end on for myself was that I find this kind of apophatic mysticism, this idea that things are and aren't, or that like certain kinds of things, like secrets, riddles, mysteries, are intrinsically non-describable. And so if the nature of reality, if the nature of reality is a mystery, then we wouldn't be able to describe it, because as soon as you did, it wouldn't be reality. And I'm not saying it is, because I couldn't say that even if it were, but that's kind of a space I've become more comfortable in, and more comfortable talking about. The way I've integrated that into my life is that it has a lot of practical implications, about the kinds of things you tell people, and the kinds of certainties you can hold and the kinds of certainties you can't hold. So, even if I'm not in an experience at any given time, the truths of the experience, if you will, truths, rules, whatever. I don't know. I don't know. You already know I don't like these words anyway, or I do. They're fine. They hold. So they kind of shape my relationship with how I talk about things to people, or the sorts of claims I'm comfortable making,
Right.
to myself or to others. So that's how it really affects my life. I mean, one practical way I think they have affected my life that I feel comfortable talking about is they have made it much easier for me to admit I'm wrong about stuff. Now, there's the danger of turning that into a kind of its own sort of showy virtue, but it's usually pretty hard to be like, I don't know, I was wrong. And these experiences have, I think, kind of loosened up whatever part of me it was that was reluctant to do that. So that's something that I've become much more comfortable with. So that's part of my life that I'm really grateful to the experiences for. Another thing I would say is that they made me much more there are certain things that I feel more strongly about. So I have really come to detest, I think that's a fine word to use, gurus, especially people who pretend to heal or pretend to have. And when I say pretend to heal, I don't mean there's certain kinds of healing that I'm okay with, but like pretend that they like fixed your back, or pretend that they got rid of your cancer, or pretend that they can levitate, or pretend. Those kinds of things are deeply distasteful to me. And I think that those people are doing something really bad. And so while I've become less comfortable telling my students what to believe about a whole range of stuff, I'm much more comfortable saying to them, look, if someone has come along and told you they have the key to fixing yourself spiritually, or even the key to healing yourself, that is a person you ought to be very, very suspicious of. And there's a passage in the Tao Te Ching where, again, I'm paraphrasing, where it says the sage, the true sage, moves among the people and things harmonize, but the people believe that they have done it of themselves. In other words, the sage is invisible. The sage just moves through reality. It's not like the sage is like, hey guys, I got the answer. People are like, thanks for the answer. And they apply it in their own life. The sage just moves through reality, and people spontaneously fix things and think they did it themselves. But in fact, it's the power of the invisible sage. To me, I like that idea. and people
Yeah,
that
no, I remember
insist,
reading,
you
I
know,
remember I had when I was 16 a book called Wisdom of the Taoist Masters. It was this funky, weird, cheaply printed book with a yellow cover, but it had Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi, and the third one you mentioned, Lao Tse.
Liezi. Yeah, I mean they're always
Yeah,
different.
yeah,
They're
yeah, yeah.
always different,
It
like
had those three, and I
translations.
loved the idea of hidden masters
Yeah,
who actively avoided recognition and were happy to look like fools.
right. Why, or just even not like this to me. So that's something I'm really I that goes with my sort of wariness about
Very
hierarchies.
anti-Western, very,
Yeah,
very non-Western.
absolutely. Jesus proclaims himself. They kill him. You know, these the Chinese sages live to a ripe old age. And I'm not saying there's like better or worse, but like, you know, if someone comes along and they're declaring that they know what's going on, if you're vulnerable, it's really that's something that you need. And I think in a way, actually, I think there's something to Christian spirituality that's extremely helpful with suffering, like with people who are suffering. I think Christianity really, really knows how to intervene and bring you
Mm,
back from the brink.
mm.
But I mean, really, you really got really is that what sages do? They go around talking about how they're sages? Like, doesn't I don't know. To me,
Right.
it
Well, and
seems
also,
ridiculous. You know?
right, right. I mean, also the kind of, the healing through charisma is is big in the New Testament,
Yeah,
of course.
yeah.
And I don't know. I don't know what I think about it. I have also over the last 3 years during the pandemic been on a real disenchantment, disillusion, quite hostile. I mean, to spirituality, that the state of mind.
Just in
Um,
general.
uh, yeah, I've been. I mean, I didn't really choose to, but it's partly a reaction to kind of conspiracy theories being rife in spiritual culture. So I
Mm.
wrote about conspirituality, and then I wrote often about I was researching kind of spirituality and eugenics. So the amount of people in New Age culture who've got into eugenics and into hierarchies. And so I've got a paper coming out like next week on the cultural frame of evolutionary spirituality and how it informs
Wow.
psychedelics.
You
And it's
have to
called,
send that to me. That sounds fascinating.
yeah, it's called More Evolved Than You. So it's all
Yes,
about,
yes.
well, I'm more evolved than you.
It just seems to me, again, it seems to me, who am I to say? But if there's any marker of someone who's not a sage, it's that they're telling you they
Yeah.
are. Now,
Yeah.
look, like they may well be doing that because there are all sorts of ways to be sages, I'm sure, you know, infinite ways. And perhaps there are some skilled sages out there that know what they're doing and know how to deploy that technique effectively and without harming people. I am, I think, you know, I'm wary of it. I'm wary of it, and I
Yeah.
caution people about it. I would caution people about it, and you know,
I mean, it almost it seems to go wrong more often than it goes right. And there may be teachers, but they tend to be there may be really good advanced teachers, but they tend to be not the ones who are really active on social media and have a big global following. And what's happened in New Age spirituality in the last century is it's encouraged this kind of creation of global gurus who have big, media presences, but often quite, messed up personal lives because they become like movie stars. And they're charismatic on stage and off stage they're a mess. So I agree with you about that. But let me put it back to you. Like, culture is the transmission of wisdom through generations. And that transmission involves, to some extent, talking about this aspect of human experience and trying to pass on, and in a way, um, you have made some decision to do that, to talk about this to your
absolutely,
students. And I have made some decision to write about it.
yeah,
And it's important. That is important, like, because because lots of people are taking psychedelics. and lots of people are practicing the, contemplative practices. So lots of 19-year-olds
Yeah.
like us are having weird experiences, and they're going, "What's this?"
Okay, so this is so one way I think about this stuff. Another way, this is different, a different thing that I'm interested in, which is the figure of the jester as a
Right. You're
kind
working on
of,
a book on this.
yeah, that's right, called The Gentleman and the Jester, which are two different ways of teaching morality. And what I think the jester is, in my own conception of it, is a kind of, it's the safety valve that allows a self-contained system to change itself. So it's the king needs the jester, because if the jester isn't there to speak truth to power, then there's no way to revise the things that the king is saying. So you always need something like the jester in there as a kind of engine of humility, epistemic humility, so that you don't end up, in a spiral of narcissism, really, if you want to talk about it like that. And so with psychedelics, if I were in charge of some psychedelic camp, or if I were in charge of anything, I would be building in humility guardrails everywhere, which is what I think certain kinds of texts do. So when you're joking around, or when your text is a joke, or when your text is a riddle, or when your text is a paradox, those are, I think, guards against getting turned into prophetic revelations and truth and that sort of thing. You can't turn a joke into a prophetic revelation without ruining the joke, And so I think that that's what I would want to do with these spiritual experiences. The problem with that is, I'm sure you know better than I, is that if you're promising someone you're going to help them get over their depression with a psilocybin trip, it's hard. Framing all of this stuff with humility and uncertainty and mystery is not how, that's just not how medicine works, right? Medicine is like, well, you've got a 72% chance of like healing your leg with this or whatever, and so I
Yeah.
don't know how you would sort of bring
Well,
those together,
I would
because to me
say,
humility is like it's a really important part
yeah.
of it.
So I would say two things. On the point about humor, what unfortunately also happens in spiritual land is the performance of spiritual wisdom in the 20th and 21st century, particularly after the 60s, particularly. Became a kind of performance, and it's and you see this also in kind of probably churches and synagogues as well. It becomes a form of stand-up, and so unfortunately you can have a massive spiritual ego and be very funny, and a lot of the famous gurus they were very funny. So I think about like Osho or Ram Dass or Russell Brand, or these they're anyway. So unfortunately,
Yeah, that's really
humor
interesting.
becomes a charismatic tool of influence,
You're totally right.
of influence and
Totally right.
power.
Yeah.
And then the second point. What the hell was the second point? Oh yes, kind of. Oh yeah, you're talking about humility in medicine, and that's a really good point. But it's also because when you're talking about spiritual healing, you're partly talking about placebo response, and the more you seem certain, actually, the more placebo response you get. So if you have a doctor saying, "Okay, this might work, might not," but that's going to actually have less of a placebo response than if you have someone coming in going, I know this is going to change your life."
Yeah, it's gonna work better. What the hell am I even talking about? I take everything back. I think I just got caught in the trap, which is that I think I need a jester. But like if someone's insecure, like if someone's like lacking confidence or scared or alone or afraid or in pain, like why would they need a jester? I don't know what they need is someone who's like, I got you, man. Like we're gonna get you out of this. Here's how we're gonna do it. We're gonna do this, and in fact, a framework, right? Like a hierarchical framework, right? Here's the plan. Here's the 12-step plan, or whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
So actually, I take it all back. I made the same mistake I always fucking do, which is I I think maybe what I'm saying is I need that, and I think that if yeah, I need that, and they need to exist in the world, that there need to be jesters out there. And by jesters, I don't mean charismatic leaders who are funny. I mean figures whose job it is to undermine charisma. but don't actually teach anything themselves. Jesters don't teach
Mm.
anything. You're not supposed to imitate jesters. You're not supposed to be like the jester, right? Whereas I think with Russell Brand or Ram Dass or any of these people, there's an implied, even if they disavow it, there's an implied, I would love to be like this guy.
Yeah.
Whereas with jesters, it's not it at all. They're disfigured, they're
Yeah.
crazy, they're mean. They're not like, be like me. It's not even implied. It's just, are you sure you want to be
Yeah.
like you?
Yeah, that makes sense.
But yeah, but I don't know if that's what everyone needs. So I take it all back. I'm sorry. And you're right about the humor thing too.
No. Okay, so one thing I want to ask you about is when I think about so in the kind of 20th and 21st century, people are still often having spiritual experiences, awakening experiences, illumination experiences. They're often increasingly having them outside of a particular religious tradition. And maybe in the kind of new age culture, or not even in that. And so this has been happening since William James, since around that time, right?
Yeah.
Kind of late 19th century, maybe even a bit earlier, early 20th century, and then lots more in the 60s. So you got, and you used to have like they called it the three legs of the stool in the Anglican Church, or maybe in the church in general. It was like experience, literature, and teachers. No, and community. So experience, authority, and community. And what's happened over the last century is more and more you just have experience. And you go to a retreat for experience, and they give you a bit of teaching, but basically it's just individual experience. And that's kind of both liberating because you don't have to conform to anyone's dogma, and it can be bewildering and atomizing.
Yeah.
So I wonder, you are a religious studies scholar who studies religious traditions to some extent, or or other cultural traditions, and you're having these occasional experiences of illumination and bliss. How do you relate them to particular? Did you ever try and kind of fit them into cultural frameworks, like Taoism or any other, or did you or into communities as well? Like, did you feel the need to kind of like, so often, that's why people join churches. They sometimes they have awakening experience and they're like, well, is this just me on my own, or can I do this? Can I experience this with others? And if this involves some kind of God, can I worship that God with others? So how do you
Yeah.
relate to different kind of cultures and communities, or has it been you haven't felt the need to do that?
I've not felt the need to do that. I want to say, well, okay, so I'm going to answer that personally, but I wanted to speak to something that you were talking about, which I thought was really interesting, where you said late 19th, early 20th century, these experiences became divorced from community and that kind of stuff. And I think this is I mean, if I'm putting on my sort of intellectual historian cap and tying it to the stuff I've studied about nature, this was this idea that, well, actually, the true way of being is freed from all of this cultural dross and dogma, that our natural state is an enlightened state. And what we have to do is strip away all the community and strip everything else. You go out on the mountain and you take off your clothes. It's like the sort of Zorba the Greek-ish kind of approach to
and
freedom,
it's romantic.
Freedom and nature, and it's romantic. That's right.
And it's Emerson going into the forest.
That's right. And I think actually that it makes sense that then psychedelics, I mean, it's interesting, the ketamine stuff. I'm curious to see that, because I think a lot of what people like, especially guys like, like Terrence McKenna and these sort of early guys, like there was this idea that like shrooms or ayahuasca were like natural. And so that what we're doing with these things, that they're actually gateways placed here by the ordering force that existed before us. And if we pass through these gateways, not the fake ones made by churches or whatever, but the real ones that grow out of the ground, then we will ourselves be free or something, and so I'd be interested, like these churches like ketamine or LSD, I feel like there would be at least a natural, if you will, tension between the manufactured nature of the substance and what I think would be a kind of underlying sense of getting in touch with your quote unquote natural self. I don't know if you've encountered that. Or if there's tensions between the communities where the shroom people are like, no, your ketamines are fake, but the shrooms are real. Like, smoke the weed and take the shrooms, but don't do the ecstasy or the acid, because those are, you can only do DMT or whatever. I don't know. Is that something that happens? Like, is there debate within the communities between?
Yeah, you're going to make another point, so keep it in mind.
I
I
will.
think, but it absolutely does, and all New Age culture gets into all sorts of funny contortions around this. I don't know if I told you this when we were talking on Twitter, but I mean, I was in the first in 2020, or might have been early 2021, when I first came to Costa Rica, where I live now. I was staying in a kind of hippie retreat place, and I met a psychedelic facilitator there. And so, she was very anti-vax. She thought that vaccines were dirty pollutants. That's how she thought of them. Dirty industrial pollutants, man-made synthetic nasty chemicals which pollute the natural purity of our body. She also thought of psychedelics as spirit allies. So certain chemicals were dirty man-made pollutants, and certain other chemicals were spirit allies. And she included MDMA in that. So not just magic mushrooms and ayahuasca, but also MDMA. And that struck me as an interesting kind of dichotomy, that these chemicals are nasty pollutants and these are spirit allies. And I thought about, like, people like old school alchemists like Paracelsus, or maybe like Alexander Shulgin. For them, all chemicals are kind of allies with their own characteristics. You would never say that, including new chemicals that Shulgin was making. These are, like Paracelsus would think of all chemicals as potentially they have their own spirit, their own character.
Yeah. It's interesting you're saying spiritual emergency. I mean, now I'm just thinking about, my work I've done on naturalness and authenticity, right?
Yeah.
So there's one of the things is there's also this sense that when you are in an ecstatic experience, you are seeing things as they are, or that you are your authentic self. And nature is a great place to go for authenticity, in the sense that it is unauthored, right? It is the author, right? So it's the most authentic thing. And the further you get away from it, that is to say, the more humans have interfered with something, less authentic it gets. Except that for a lot, and this goes to, so then another form you could think of trying to get an ecstatic experience, you can take psychedelics, you can go off the grid, is another sort of way of having an ecstatic experience, right? It's like, I'm gonna go off the grid, I'm gonna isolate myself from society, and then I'm gonna get in touch with my authentic self. And people report this stuff, these natural gurus or whatever. But I remember I'm looking over to my shelf because I have it. There was this book of photographs called The Return that followed a group of nomads who had sworn off their lives and were just going across the country, kind of living off the land. And the book really romanticizes this lifestyle. It's really cool. These people are recovering from their depression and all this stuff through renouncing inauthentic modern life and getting in touch with nature. And then I contacted the photographer, who broke down in tears during our conversation and said he had lied in that book and left out all the bad stuff, and that two of the people that he featured had killed themselves, that he had felt like he needed to make them look a particular way. And I was like, oh my God, this is crazy. This is the dark side of another kind of approach to ecstatic experience that we believe in, because we have these weird understandings of what purity is. But it doesn't work like that, right? Nature is dark as well as light, and there's no secret, I don't know, way of being that like gives you access to all this stuff that doesn't come with its own hardships. And so I see a lot of parallels between this idea, like the people that are like, here's a path through psychedelics or through religion, frankly, to enlightenment or purity, and people who are like, here's a path to it through nature and naturalness. And that's, I think, why they overlap so much in wellness communities and anti-vaccine stuff, and and so on.
Well, 100%. And the our kind of cultural arguments and confusions around nature go right the way through this discourse on spiritual emergencies. in terms of your attitude to your experience, is this a chemical disorder in your mind for which you need medication? That's one way of thinking, but often the kind of counter argument which you get in like the mad pride movement or the spiritual awakening movement is, this is a shamanic awakening. You are a shaman. You are being called to a life of shamanism. So you're either, you're going down, the sterile corridors of psychiatry and the DSM, or it's down this path, which is headdresses and tambourines and apprenticeships with African or Amazon tribes, and hardcore psychedelics. So this is rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
By the by, and there's not the room for ambiguity.
Well, okay.
Which is, they can be a bit of both. The person I just interviewed says, he went to the head of psychiatry at Columbia after his messy awakening, and he said, I think there might be something spiritual to this. And the what the head of psychiatry at Columbia did? He tapped his scalp and said, if I stimulate this part of your brain, I can make you believe in God. Isn't that dark to say to someone during an awakening experience?
It's funny, yeah. It's this now all sorts of thoughts from what you just said related to where you asked how I fit this into my life. So a couple of things. One is, I think everyone, myself included, who has these experiences or studying these experiences in them or outside of them is interested in empirical evidence, if you will, of them, right? So it's like whether that means like talking to an angel or whether it means the ability to levitate or make fire. So one thing that happened during that experience was I was a music minor, a jazz minor, and I'm a guitarist, but I have to pass a piano proficiency exam in order to get my minor. And I became instantaneously good at piano, which was a really remarkable thing to experience. And so that's something I've also researched, which was people who have had, I think there's a word for this where you like become like sudden onset savant syndrome or something. I didn't become a savant, but I went from really not being able to read piano music at all and needing to practice to like, I just passed my piano proficiency test. And that to me said something about what it was, that it was real and that there were some things changing, and that perhaps, and this is, it's like Robert Johnson at the Crossroads, like you talk with the devil and you're all of a sudden able to play blues guitar or something. But that was something that really stuck with me. At the same time, the chemicals bouncing around in your head thesis, where I'm like, okay, well, maybe it's that. So I actually I've contemplated when I'm in these states, I'm like, should I just get down to like UVA neurology and have them scan my brain? Like I'm having it again. I might as well, But the thing is,
I mean, yes, it would be interesting data.
Yeah, absolutely. I would have. I don't know. I don't know. I guess I don't know how comfortable I would be with that. Maybe I would. I don't know. I think that origins are a part of essence, and so when people are like, "Well, is this chemicals bouncing around in the brain?" To me, it seems it is missing the importance of the story itself. So whether you took a psychedelic to catalyze the experience, or whether you had it in church, or whether it was spontaneous, those are actually, I think, really important. And it doesn't matter if it's chemically identical in your brain, in the same way that it doesn't matter if a diamond is chemically identical, like a factory-made diamond is chemically identical to a diamond that was dug up. They are different diamonds in light of their origin. And
yes.
And
this is true of experience. This is true of all human experience, not just religious experience.
That's right.
Yes. It's just that psychiatry, because it was engaged in a historical tug of war with the Catholic Church, particularly focused on religious experiences. But you could say that about any experience, and it just becomes boring, and it confuses neural correlates with causes. And all religious practices are about, transforming the mind body, through fasting, through sensory deprivation,
and the thing is,
through concentration practices.
You relate to these experiences. This is the other thing that I think is just really important about them. So you take shrooms, or you have a spontaneous experience, or whatever, but it's not self-contained. So it is also itself after you're out of it. and you relate to experiences based in part on how they were catalyzed, because you're telling yourself a story about how it happened to begin with. And so there is no way, in my opinion, that a mushroom trip can ever be the same thing as a spiritual experience that you had in a church, which can never be the same thing as a spontaneous religious experience, simply because of the banal truth that when you are looking back on it and asking what it's taught you, a part of that question and answer is going to be, where did it come from? And if it came from a mushroom, it's just, you're just going to relate to it differently than if it came from baptism, and you're going to relate to that differently than if it just happened when you were walking down the street, et cetera, right? Yeah, or near death experience. And I just think that's something really important to take into account, that in our non-narrative kind of, let's just look at reality objectively, which means abstracting material from narrative or something like that, we're just missing a really important feature of how these things work. You know?
Yeah, I agree. I agree. So are you then, I mean, are you a Taoist, an atheist, an agnostic? And then maybe you don't think in these terms.
So this is that, those are the kinds of questions that, like, you know, at the end of my class, when I teach an intro class, I always tell my students on the last day of class, you can ask me whatever you want and I'll answer as best I can. So they'll say things like, are you an atheist? And I'll tell them, I don't think,
are they all Christian?
That many of them, I'm in Virginia, so maybe like 2/3 maybe are, you know, are
this is
practicing
the difference
Christians.
between American and British universities.
A third of them are very religious, you know. I say to them, I don't believe that there is a God that wants stuff and makes lists of rules and talks to people. And if that's what we mean by theism, then I am an atheist. I don't believe in that kind of God. But I also tell them, I don't believe in any revealed truths. So when John Dowling says, on this day, the Tao came and the Tao told me these are the rules for living life, or whatever.
Is there a Taoist who says that?
Yeah. Lots of revelations in later religious Taoist traditions, because it's the Taoist classics, immediately the paradoxical stuff, in the same way that it got subsumed by New Age teachings on how you should be relaxed, it got subsumed by religious Taoist teachings on how you could, you know, create a spirit fetus inside you so you could live forever, right? So I don't believe in that. I don't believe in revealed texts. There are no texts that were delivered by a deity that have timeless truths, and there is no deity that talks to people or tells them so. So I tell my students I don't believe in any of that, but I'm extremely religious. And I am religious because I believe that there is magic, sparkle dust, whatever you want to call it. Like, there is something beyond and before humans, and some kind of mystical organizing force for which I'm grateful. And and I would never describe myself as non-religious. I used to say spiritual but not religious, you know, but spiritual has all these weird connotations. You know, so I'm deeply religious. I believe in that. It has very important things for how I live my life built into it. I think you can harmonize with it more or less. And that's just really, really important.
And when you're thinking about how to harmonize it more or less, that's partly things which you have kind of figured out in your life, partly things you've read. Yeah.
I mean, I believe that see, it's hard. This is where I'm like, like this magic sparkle dust is like, watch it, buddy. I think that a lot of the time in our lives, the magic sparkle dust is like, here's what you should be doing. And we don't do it because of things that Christianity might call sin. And I think, or what Buddhism or you know, New Age Buddhism might call ego or self, whatever you want to call it. And I think that we can listen. I think that just really believing that like knowing, this is the religiosity, knowing that if you do that, you will harmonize more with reality, makes it easier to do it. Because it's hard to go out on a limb and sacrifice personal interests or whatever it is, or just get motivated to do something if you're not entirely sure it's going to work, if you will. The thing is, what it is for it to work, and this is something I also believe, is not that you get what you want. That's not how it works. So it's always mysterious. So I'll tell you a game I play with the magic sparkle dust in my own life. Is sometimes, and I do this a lot, I'll be like, okay, what's going to happen? And I'll go through all the possibilities of a particular thing, that like a significant thing is coming up in my life or something like that. I'll try to go through every single one, because I know inevitably what happens is that whatever happens is never any of those possibilities. It's always something I didn't think of. And so I think it's also important to realize that if you harmonize in this way, it doesn't mean that you're going to get what you want, but like the kids in the burning house that leave and get something even better, if you will, than what they wanted, you'll get what you needed. You might find you get what you need, as the Rolling Stones would have it. And so I do believe in that. And yeah, and so that's another way of saying this. Yes, can I say this? I think it's all, I would never say this to someone who is suffering. So if someone's suffering and listening to this right now, this is not for you. But I think it's all, I think there is a harmony to things. Now, I don't know where to fit suffering into that. And so I guess maybe there isn't a harmony to things. I don't know. I take that back. Why was I saying that? If it doesn't, I can't believe I said that. I don't. I mean,
it's.
I take it back. I take it all back, please. Abort.
No, I don't know.
There's not a harmony. I stand by everything else, but not the harmony.
Well, no, you feel that. You feel that when you're in, when you feel, there are moments when one feels everything's okay. And of course, that's hard to fit in with kind of, suffering. But it is, I mean, it's what people often feel, and it actually helps them sometimes. They sometimes have those moments amidst terrible suffering.
Yeah, everything happens for a reason kind of stuff.
Yeah, like kind of, just like this is part of some bigger pattern, and I'm experiencing it as an individual, and so it's kind of awful, but and so that does happen to people, and it's not totally trite to kind of say, because it's actually the basis of most religion.
Yeah, I'm now like, I don't, okay. I'm just going to, I want to talk about that. But you said something which I thought was really interesting just now. You used the word pattern, which is something that actually lines up with your maps and hierarchies that you were talking about earlier. It's interesting to me. This is something else I believe. I believe that for myself, I believe that that there's something about pattern offering comfort that is not compatible with mystery offering comfort. Because pattern is not mystery. Pattern, in a certain sense, is the opposite of mystery. And so if at least a part of reality is intrinsically mysterious, if the only place we can get comfort is from pattern, we're going to be in trouble. That's something else I believe. And I also believe that at least part of reality, not all of it, but at least part of it is intrinsically mysterious. And I believe there are ways to harmonize with mystery, but they involve being able to not turn mystery into pattern. And that's a spiritual capability, I believe, that takes a lot of effort. Randomness is scary. Often chaos can be scary or dangerous or harmful.
Yeah.
But if you keep trying to fit everything into a pattern, that becomes sort of monomaniacal. And I think there will be times when you bump up against stuff that resists it in ways that cause you harm.
Right. I mean, and it's in a way, it's a great reason not to write about it too much and not to talk about it too much, because it reminds me of I don't know if you've ever read or listened to talks by Alan Watts.
Yes, yes, I wanted to bring him
Yeah,
up earlier. I'm glad you brought him up.
yeah, and he's fantastic on Taoism, isn't he? And he's fantastic on the,
Generally, just a
um,
really interesting and wise dude.
yeah, and he brings Taoism to California, along with other people, and he talks about that we can't fit nature into our rigid maps or into language, and yet he also becomes a bit trapped by certain material needs. He has heavy alimony payments, and by his success and this role of the jester, of the philosophical entertainer he's become. And and in his 50s he's having to do talks almost every night, basically turning on the charisma and channeling the Tao on demand. And he's having to, from what I hear and read, like, drink beforehand, because it's to kind of deal with the feeling of exhaustion and inauthenticity,
Yeah.
in order to get into that state for his adoring fans. Which is, I mean, maybe that's just how it is, but it's sad as well. And maybe it didn't have to be like that. And but yeah, so it's just another kind of, your your strategy about not necessarily over talking about it, I think, that is not the strategy that Alan Watts took.
No, well, and it's funny. Watts, I I remember reading in one of his books. I think it's the only one I've read all the way through was Psychoanalysis East and West, and I thought it was a really good book.
Mm.
And at one point, though, I found myself really disagreeing with him, which was about whether you needed to be enlightened in order to teach enlightenment, the path to enlightenment. And I think he said no. And I remember sort of viscerally reacting against that. But then I was thinking, well, that can't be true. I mean, of course you can. You can out of the most noxious personalities or teachings. There's no, it's sort of Zen in the art of motorcycle. Right? If the Buddha can live in a tree, the Buddha can live in a motorcycle engine. I mean, I guess the Buddha can live in anybody. And just like tennis coaches don't have to be better than you at tennis, I don't see why spiritual coaches have to have themselves, their lives in order. However, I think that if your identity becomes tied to the to arguments about the nature of truth or reality, it is very, very hard to stay healthy. And again, there may be very advanced spiritual teachers who can do this. It's sort of like there's this Buddhist story about a guy named Captain Compassion who's on this ship, and he finds out that someone's going to rob the ship, and he knows the thief is going to kill all the other merchants and rob the ship.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, what do I do? Well, if I tell the other merchants, they're going to kill this guy, the thief, and they're going to take on the bad karma of having killed him because they're going to get so angry.
Mm-hmm.
And if I kill the thief, and if I let the thief do it, like, then the thief is going to take on the bad karma of murdering these people and stealing their money. It means, well, the best thing to do in order to reduce suffering is for me to kill the thief. That way, the thief doesn't have to go to hell. I can take his place, and the other people don't have to go to hell. I can take their place. So there's this really interesting story about skillful means and violence. And at one point, a high-ranking lama was asked, well, so is this true? Like, is it true that you can really kill people as a part of compassion? Mm. And he says, yes, but I've never met anyone spiritually advanced enough to pull it off.
God. I'm glad he said that, because I think there is a tradition of human sacrifice in Tibetan Buddhism.
Yeah. And I just thought that was what a great answer. It's like, oh, so could you be spiritually advanced enough where you just tell everyone that you have the answer and then like propagate this pattern into reality that's actually it is entirely possible. I have never seen anyone who did it, who was spiritually advanced enough to do it without damaging themselves and and other people as well. Poor Juan.
So, yeah, go on.
No, that's it. It just sucks.
So, I mean, if if we're going to kind of bring this first conversation to a kind of close, I think I think it's been super interesting, and it's also very interesting for me, just talking to you as well after this previous conversation I had. I see all kinds of interesting parallels. I really like the idea of the kind of relating to the mystery respectfully and skillfully, and I just think that's so important in all the ways we try to commodify and instrumentalize the sacred, or just for our own certainty as well. And it always reminds me of Adam Watts too, like the wisdom of insecurity. Like, like this is going to happen, right? This is definitely going to happen if I do this.
Yeah. That's second. So this is, I'm really excited about this sort of psychedelic renaissance, I guess you could call it.
Yeah, which we haven't talked about much. So we can talk about that but yeah, tell me about
conversation. Yeah, no, I'm just gonna say I'm really excited about it. I'm excited because, as you know better than I, it's ludicrous that there are these substances that catalyze these experiences and we don't take them seriously. I mean, it's just amazing. It's just wild, right? Here are these people taking, there are all these substances you can take and you like see God or little creatures or whatever, or like you turn into a crow. And it's like, how are we not obsessed with studying these things? We're like, so I think that's great. I just really, like you said, this sort of distaste for the ways in which it can go bad, not just in terms of bad trips or spiritual emergencies, as you said, but also, which I guess is a different form of spiritual emergency, the sort of narcissism of feeling like it's a heavy drug to feel like you figured it out. I know, I remember acid was very much like that for me. And I took acid and it was like, all of a sudden I was just like, oh, I got it now. Like I see all the connections, which was very different from my spiritual experience, but it's like, I see it all, right? I get it. I'm better than my past self. That's just that can be empowering. And I can see how for someone who's really struggling with feeling like they know anything or really just don't feel like they don't get anything, I could see how that would be really therapeutic. But it might be helpful to think about, the same way that I'm sure. Well, actually, this is sort of different from CBT, which I know you've talked about. I watched your TED Talk. There's going to be different things that are good for different people. Right. So if you're a raging narcissist, the last thing you need is an acid trip, where possibly, maybe you need something else. And if you're someone who's just, way too giving of yourself with your friends, maybe you don't need to take any E, I don't know. So I would really like to see people approaching these things not as gateways to some kind of invisible pattern of truth that we can get to, but as what I think a lot of people who are researching this thing is like, that more tools in our toolkit for experiencing reality in all of the forms that it can take, without thinking it's some kind of key. It is no more. It is like learning the guitar. Cool, could make you really excited, could give you meaning. Music's beautiful, but it's not like only guitarists will fully understand reality. It's just not a good way to approach it, just a different way to approach it.
Yeah, I agree. I'm excited a lot by the fact that this subject matter that I'm interested in, mystical experiences and so forth, is becoming more mainstream and is being reported on by the Wall Street Journal or what have you. And that's both kind of really interesting and and a bit daunting as well. And I feel the same with you. My main concern is that these experiences are becoming much more common in a culture which doesn't have very good cultural infrastructure for them, because these experiences haven't been very common, or at least not much talked about for 200, 300 years. And I worry also about just a general increase in craziness, cultishness, conspiracy thinking. And kind of these things that open people's minds will then lead to narrowing of their realities.
Absolutely.
So I think, and I guess I think that the humanities have a role in that, because the humanities are about, they are more comfortable with things like ambiguity than the sciences, and also with things like symbol interpretation and experience interpretation, hermeneutics. This is Kripal's argument about the mystical humanities. And there is now this psychedelic humanities, which, I've got this essay on evolutionary spirituality is in a special edition of Frontiers on the psychedelic humanities. So there are psychedelic bioethicists. There's people in literary studies looking at semantics, and language, and how that relates to trips, anthropology, philosophy of mind, psychedelic historians like Mike J and others. So it's quite, and no subject is more rich for interdisciplinary conversations. You think about the word psychedelic came out of a conversation, a correspondence between Aldous Huxley, the novelist, and Humphrey Osmond, the psychiatrist, who had this great decade-long interdisciplinary friendship, very close friendship. So yeah, very, and yes, I also think, so I think I would love it if you were writing on this and talking about it and thinking about it.
I would like, I think my next stage, I don't know how much of this should be in some kind of podcast, like for now, but my next stage of sort of things I'm interested in researching, and they're related. One is my own personal experiences. I just want to know more people like this. I'm just curious who's out there, what's similar. So like talking with people like you is great. I'm also really interested in quantification.
Yeah.
I think it is, like you were talking about magic, it has incantatory power. And it's a kind of incantatory power that's so dominant now that it's become invisible. But I think it's a dangerous sort of incantatory power when it monocultures our spell casting. And right now, that's the kind of spell casting we do. And it's very powerful. And I think it can have distorting effects, black magic, whatever you want to call it. So that's something I'm interested in as well.
Yes, very interesting. The guy I interviewed before, or two days ago, I think it was, or maybe it was yesterday. It was yesterday. Talks about Moloch. Have you come across this idea of Moloch?
Yeah, what's up with that? I've seen this in just like a couple
on Twitter.
Of places. Yeah, what is this?
Moloch is, I don't know, I'm not very familiar with it, but it's an essay by the psychiatrist, blogger, rationalist Scott Alexander.
Yeah,
about,
I know him. Okay, so it came from him.
People create abstract systems which then become like demonic, and they start living their lives according to the abstract systems rather than according to reality. So like an algorithm. But there's all kinds of ways that, and so I think quantification can become like that, and higher education is an example of that, and that's a risk with the science of spirituality, for all its good intentions, that it collapses ambiguity.
And we have seen, in the same way that you're sort of doing this comparative look at psychedelic experience and ecstatic experience, this is not a new thing. People have been into magic numbers since numbers existed. I was like, 8 is the lucky number. Looking at the stars. The idea, like the incantatory power of numbers, is cross-cultural and trans-historical. Kabbalah, all sorts of stuff. We're going to turn these letters into numbers, and we're going to add them together, and that's going to be the truth. Is something that's been around for a very long time. And again, I think it's sort of mania for pattern, as a form of comfort. And so people cast patterns onto reality. And it's very empowering, but it's also, like you said, it can turn demonic pretty quickly as it monocultures the way that you see everything.
That's true. I hadn't thought of that. You're right. Well, it was a real pleasure to meet you, Alan.
Yes,
and
thanks for talking, Jules. We could. I was like, I feel bad for talking so long, but also just like enjoying the conversation. It was really great.
Yeah, real pleasure. I'm going to put you in touch with, some other researchers, like in this Emergent Phenomena Research Consortium. I think you'll enjoy that. And yeah, I mean, let's talk again in a few weeks. Let's have another kind of conversation.
Yeah, I'd love to. And if you ever come across people, please, who have had, again, like I said, I just really don't very often find when I'm looking around, people who have had these like longer term non-catalyzed, so like no meditation when it, I've only had one of the experiences in my life was like, could I even trace to like a particular cause? It's like non-catalyzed, non-denominational spirit, long-term spiritual experiences, I guess, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
So
If you can describe the rough outlines of what, you know,
yeah,
I can share that with some networks of researchers and ask them.
I would, yeah, I would love that. That'd be great. I would appreciate
Yeah.
it. It's so cool to talk with someone who knows so much about this.
Yeah. All right. Great to see you.
Yeah, take care, Jules.
Take care. Bye.